Now, if you've ever been in love before, you know that it's not something that really just kind of like happens right away, right? There's this awkward period of time where you notice and you see them around, and you notice how good they look, and you want to say something, but you can't until one day you finally get the chance to meet them. And so this day in fourth grade, I finally got to meet my first love. And when I was introduced to this first love of mine, I was ecstatic. This love of mine was awesome. Whenever I was around this love of mine, I couldn't help but smile. I always had fun. My heart would race. I would get all sweaty, right? All day I would think about this first love of mine, and I would imagine spending time together. But sadly, I only got to see this love of mine for about an hour each day. During the time that we were together, I was constantly embarrassing myself. Sometimes I would trip and fall. Other times I would get really frustrated because I just couldn't do things as well as I wanted to. But I practiced and I got better. And when I moved to Oklahoma in the 6th grade, my first love came with me. And I would spend about an hour a day at school with this love of mine, and then hours after school. And I have to tell you, some of my favorite memories from my childhood and all through high school were with this love of mine. Now, many of you are in here like, I'm so angry at this guy who's talking. Like, you have a wife in this room. What do you do? Oh, okay, will you show the picture of me with my first love? Yeah, basketball. Right, basketball was my first love. Yeah, that's why I got all sweaty and my heart was racing. Yeah, yes, basketball was my first love. You can go ahead and move past it. Basketball was my first love. In fact, I loved basketball more than almost anything, and for a while, probably more than anything. But then, somewhere in high school, maybe a little bit earlier, something started to change a little bit. There was something else that I started to love more than basketball. And what I can say is the one thing that I know that I definitely loved more than basketball was myself. This became very clear, maybe not so clear to me back then, but clear to me now as I'm looking back, realizing that I started worrying more about how cool I looked. I started worrying more about how impressive I was to other people than I did about just getting better at the game. I really, let me tell you, I really wanted to be cool. At some point in my life, I've just given up on that. I've realized that's not going to happen. But I really, when I was in high school, I really wanted to look cool. I wanted to look good. I wanted to be impressive. And so when I made mistakes, I wasn't thinking about how I could use that to become a better player. No, instead, I was thinking about how I needed to do better so that I wouldn't be so embarrassed next time. Other people saw that. Other people saw that. And so, unfortunately, when I look back at it now, one of the most embarrassing things is something that I actually did because I thought it made me look cool. So if any of you have ever watched, been to like a high school basketball game, there's this period of time, right, or even, past that, where before the game starts, there's this time that is set up that I thought was there to honor the best players that both teams had. You would line up however that was. For me and for my team, the starters would be sitting on the bench, and anybody who was not starting would form like a tunnel, kind of going off of it, and there'd be like one person at the end. And I can remember that I spent way too much time coming up with some kind of idea that I thought was going to make me look really cool, and it was this handshake, right? So they'd call my number, they'd say Andrew Wallen. I'm like, that's not my last name. But I would get up anyways. I'm like, oh, you're ruining my moment, dude. And I'd go through the tunnel, hitting everybody's hands, and I'd get to the end, and we had this incredible handshake that, like I said, we spent way too much time crafting. Fortunately for me, I wasn't the only one who did this. There was other people on my team who did. And so we would go out there, and we would do our handshakes, and then we would lose a basketball game. But the handshake, let me tell you, we spent a lot of time on that handshake. Now, let me tell you, the thing that I'm the most embarrassed about is not the handshake itself. That was fire. The thing that I'm embarrassed about is that I had this really cool, elaborate handshake with this teammate of mine who, by the way, this was like his first year playing basketball. And so, like, that's all he had was a handshake. He got like 2 minutes a game. We had this really cool handshake, right? And so I would go out there then, and I would be the most average basketball player you've ever seen in your life. Like, sometimes below average, probably more than I would like to admit or want to remember. I just was not this outstanding basketball player who really deserved to have some kind of fancy handshake. But what I wanted was as I went through that tunnel of players, I wanted people to notice me. I wanted people to pay attention to me. I wanted people to think, oh, this is one of their good players, right? Like, no one spends that much time on a handshake and then sucks. Surprise. So we had this really cool handshake, and then I would go out and I'd score maybe like 10 points a game. Meanwhile, I had this teammate who, he did not have a handshake. He couldn't care less. In fact, he would just assume that the game gets started, not even announce names, and we just go out there and play ball, right? And so what he would do is he didn't care where anybody else sat. He let everybody else get their names called out in whatever order they wanted to be, and he just took whatever spot was left. He'd get up, and he'd just kind of like lazily go through the tunnel. He'd get to the end, no cool handshake, right? He just, another low five. He'd go up, and when I'm going it, I'm going hard, right? So like I'm running through that tunnel, and I get to the end, and I do my cool handshake, and then I turn, and I'm running to the other side, and I do the cool guy stop in front of the refs. And we get our fist bumps in, and then I twist and go, right? It was a whole ordeal. It was a routine, right? But this guy, no, he just kind of like lazily went through the tunnel, get another low five, go over to the refs, say, thanks, gentlemen, like, glad you're here. Walk out to the middle of the court and just wait for the game to start. And then he would drop 30 points a game. He didn't care about how he looked. He didn't care how cool he looked getting his name announced because he knew what he was about to go do. And in both of our cases, the way that we entered said something about us. Today, we're going to look at an entry that's going to force us to answer the most important question ever asked. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? Pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to come together in your name. We thank you that you have given us your word, that we are able to read it and to study it and to come to an understanding, to know you better, because, God, quite frankly, we don't deserve to know you at all. Our sin puts us far away from you, but you come to us. We separated ourselves from you, and yet you come to draw us near, to forgive us of those sins and to bring us into your kingdom. Let us celebrate today how magnificent and how wonderful it was what Jesus did on the original Palm Sunday. It's in Jesus Christ's name that I pray. Amen. So in order to fully understand the passage that we're going to be focusing on, we need to understand the context of the events that are taking place. And so we're going to start our study this morning, and we see Jesus leaving Jericho. And with him is a crowd of followers. This is something that is pretty typical for Jesus in his ministry. It didn't take long before crowds started following him. He would go out and he would preach, and people would start to follow him. And so We actually see several times throughout Scripture where Jesus has to try to find a way to break away from this crowd of people who are following after him. We have this idea in our heads that Jesus was this completely unpopular guy that nobody cared about, and then all of a sudden he was resurrected and now everybody cares about him, but that's not how it was. Jesus was very popular and very hated. He was the most polarizing person who has ever lived on the earth. You either loved the guy or you hated him. And so he had massive crowds of people that would follow him. And he had a great, massive group of people who hated him, at this point, he's been leading a public ministry for about 2 to 3 years. And during that time, he taught many things that were controversial. In particular, he stirred up controversy by the way he spoke to and addressed the religious leaders at the time. In his brief time of ministry, he created this significant divide in public opinion about who he was. Many called him a prophet, a rabbi, while others believed him to be a blasphemer. And because of Jesus' teachings and the things he spoke about the religious leaders, those leaders spent a considerable amount of time trying to discredit him, always speaking in parables, giving veiled clues about who he was claiming to be. Jesus was cautious. Anytime he would teach or he would heal and someone would call him Lord, he would say, quiet it down, right? Go and tell no one. Go and say nothing. There's 3 things from our passage today for us to notice that's going to help us to understand the scene of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem for the final time. It's going to help us to understand what it meant for those who witnessed it, as well as anyone who hears about these events. Read with me Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 33. And as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him. And behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd rebuked them, telling them, "Be silent." But they cried out all the more, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And stopping, Jesus called to them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. In this section of our passage today, we see a series of events that is unfolding. Firstly, the blind men hear that Jesus is passing through, and they cry out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." Before moving on, we have to take a step back and recognize just how important this is. These men give Jesus a couple titles, Lord and Son of David. The first title, Lord, by itself, while certainly an honor, it can refer to anyone who has power or authority. But when you couple it with the next title that is given, Son of David, this is a very clear message. This is a title that is not just, oh, you're from the line of David. This title is specifically referring to a very important person that the Jews were looking for, the Messiah. The person who would come and rescue them from all oppression. This warrior king that they were so excited for. And these blind men. It's unclear. We don't know if they'd ever heard Jesus teach before. We don't know if they had ever met Jesus before. But what we do know is that they call out to him, just hearing that he's passing by, "Lord, Son of David." My guess is that whether they had experienced hearing Jesus or meeting Jesus before, At some point, while Jesus was out on his ministry, these men encountered others who had encountered Jesus, and they heard all the stories. Jesus healing lepers, healing the blind, raising the lame to walk, raising the dead to life. They heard these stories. And they came to one singular conclusion: this man is the Messiah. Who has power like that? Who else? And they recognize this man is the Messiah. And so they call out to him, Lord, Son of David. Jesus' impact was so large that people who had never met him were able to rightly understand who he was. Even more interesting than the titles are the reactions to the titles by both the crowds following Jesus and Jesus himself. So let's take a look first at how the crowd reacts. The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. Why? Well, it's because they had spent a considerable amount of time with Jesus. And anytime somebody tried to call Jesus Lord or Messiah, what would he do? He would tell them to go and say nothing. Go and say nothing. And so this was something that was clearly modeled for them. And so they heard these men calling Jesus Son of David, and they recognized that title. And so they said, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't say that. We don't say that. But Jesus, what does he do? All this time, he's been staying away from making outright claims to be the Messiah. He tells others who come to understand who he is to be silent about it. But there's something different this time. Jesus stops, has compassion, and he heals the men. Now, these three things, they're not that out of character for Jesus. He did it all the time. He would stop and heal people. He'd have compassion on people. But what was different wasn't something that he did. It was something that was missing. Jesus didn't say, go and tell no one. He didn't say that. In fact, this is the first time in the story of Jesus that he allows someone to publicly declare that he was the Messiah. And the crowd knew what this meant. If the crowd knew to silence the men for their proclamation, they certainly would have understood what it means that Jesus allows it. Something has changed. And Jesus is no longer keeping this thing that has been dubbed the messianic secret. It's not a secret anymore. It's out there. Jesus is the Messiah. Let's continue to read. So the first thing that we notice is that Jesus is no longer keeping his messianic secret. Let's continue to read in chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. Now, when they draw near to Jerusalem and come to Bethphage, the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. Now the disciples and the crowds, they may be having some kind of a spiritual high or exaltation here because they've known for a while, right, what Jesus was all about. They know that he commands a power that's at least given to him by God, right? Many of them have seen many of the things that he has done. They've seen him heal the sick. They've seen him heal the blind. They've seen him heal those who were paralyzed. Some of them even witnessed him calm a storm. They know what he's about. And for the first time, Jesus is outright saying, or at least allowing it to be said about him, that he is the Messiah. And then Then this happens. And Jesus says, bring me a donkey. A donkey. How many in this room have ever rode a horse? How many in this room have ever rode a donkey? How many in this room strongly would prefer to ride a horse over a donkey? Yeah. There's a reason for that. There's a difference, right? Donkeys and horses, they are not the same thing. They're similar, but they are not the same thing. You would prefer to ride a horse, particularly if you were riding in and claiming to be king. I have seen several pictures of wars in ancient times, and do you know what I have never seen a picture of? A military leader riding in on a donkey. Why? They're slow, they're uncomfortable. There's not anything to like about riding in on a donkey. Not only that, Jesus said he needs them. This man's been walking around all over, walking. And he gets, 2 miles outside of Jerusalem? And he says, you know what I think? I just don't think I can do it. Why don't I just... He needs them. Does he really need a donkey for the last 2 miles? Let's take into consideration a little bit more. First, Jesus is stopping as they enter the town of Bethphage. Bethphage was a small town just outside of Jerusalem, and right next to another small town that you may have heard of called Bethany. They bordered each other. Really, if we're looking at it geographically, we would look at it as more of like a subdivision of a bigger city, right? They're right on the edge of Jerusalem, about 2 miles out. And he stops in Bethphage, right next to Bethany. And Bethany should sound familiar because it's the hometown of a few biblical characters that you might remember, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. In fact, it was in Bethany where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. This is an event not seen before or since to any of these people who were in the area. This is something they would not have soon forgotten. And Jesus spent a lot of time in this area. So it might be reasonable for us to assume that Jesus knew where to tell them to go get the donkey because he probably knew the owner of the donkey. And because of the time that he had spent in Bethany and around this area, they probably knew him. And in fact, I would assume that several people in the towns of Bethany and Bethphage had gotten the message, go and say nothing. Go and say nothing. And so when the disciples of Jesus arrive and they say, the Lord needs this, we could probably assume that the owner of the donkey knew who this was for. And this would have been very exciting. The Lord is here. Now then, about the question of the donkey. Why did he ask for a donkey and not a horse? Let's read on. Chapter 21, verse 4 through 11. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did as Jesus directed them. They brought the donkeys and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut the branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, Who is this? And the crowd said, This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. So then, Jesus chose to ride on a donkey, on a colt that likely had never been ridden, to fulfill a prophecy. This is the first clue to the second thing for us to notice. Here it is. Jesus was intentional about the way that he entered Jerusalem for the final time. He was intentional about it. He was making a statement with the way that he entered. Not in the way that a typical king would enter, on a large horse to signify power and authority, but instead on a donkey. This act of humility was done not to announce just any new king for the Israelites, but to announce the coming of the Messiah. This is the beginning of Jesus' major claims on identity. And the thing to notice was not necessarily that Jesus rode in on a donkey and fulfilled the prophecy, but that Jesus was in complete control, and he chose how he would reveal his nature, and he arranged it himself. He chose to ride on a donkey. And it was his followers who were with him that went in front of him and behind to announce Hosanna in the highest. This was something that for some reason, I couldn't tell you why, in all of the readings that I've done for this passage before, I always just imagined that there was like crowds already in the city, and they see him coming in on a donkey, and they would take a step back, and they would immediately recognize what that meant. And so all the people in Jerusalem that were around were like, oh, this is the Messiah, right? But that's not what's happening, because remember, Jesus was a very divisive person, and if people knew about him, they loved him or they hated him, and the people who loved him were with him. It was the crowds that were already with him, that were following him around. They would go ahead of him and announce his coming, laying down their cloaks, laying down palm trees. Can we just stop for a minute and appreciate the fact that, like 10 verses ago, they were trying to silence somebody who called him Lord, Son of David, and now they're going absolutely nuts with it. They're like, oh, okay, he's cool with it. Let's go ham, right? And so they're just like walking down the road, screaming, Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna to the Lord, the Son of David, right? They're going nuts with it. They're yelling it to everybody. People are in the city like, what's happening? I don't get it. But they are just, this is a celebration. Jesus is finally claiming to be the Messiah. And a lot of them have seen a bunch of Jesus' miracles. They are pumped to finally be able to talk about it. So Jesus makes this public proclamation to be the Messiah, but he doesn't stop with riding the donkey into town. He has more business to do on this Palm Sunday. And the first place he goes is to the temple, the central hub, the religious mainstay of the Jewish people. So he goes into the temple. Let's continue to read chapter 21, 12 through 17. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and overturned the tables of money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." And the blind and lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children ring out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, 'Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise'?" Leaving them, he went out into the city to Bethany and lodged there. This is a continuation of Jesus' announcement. He rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, making a big old ruckus. His followers screaming, "Hosanna in the highest." People asking, "Who is this?" This is the prophet. He doesn't stop there. Clearly, his announcement of riding in on the donkey was not enough, because it was missed by people in Jerusalem. Who is this? It was even missed by some of those in the crowds following him. The prophet. The prophet. We're calling this man Son of David. So Jesus continues, and he's on a mission. He walks into the temple, and he does, this is like so many people's favorite story, right? Because we always imagine Jesus, and we think of this compassionate Jesus walking around. I remember back when Sean and Amber Crawley were here, we were talking about who Jesus was and the kind of ideas that people had about Jesus, and we came up with this term for the Jesus that you always see in the paintings, where he's like walking down. He's got this lamb on his shoulders, and we called him Hoodie Jesus. Hoodie Jesus, right? The one that's just a sweet dude walking around, everybody kind of likes him. That's the impression that a lot of us have of him. But then we read this story and we're like, oh, Jesus got mad sometimes. We read this and he's like flipping tables over. And so if you grew up if you were in high school in the 2010s like I was, then you, or around that time, you probably remember that there was like all these memes where people would get mad, and it's like this drawing of a picture of a dude just like literally flipping a table. This was Jesus, right? He's walking in, flipping a table, yelling at people, calling them a den of robbers, casting them out. What he was doing here is he was cleansing the temple. It's really important to recognize the action that Jesus is taking, because this isn't just some guy who's really zealous, who's angry about the state of the temple, who is very religious and upright and says the temple is not a place for people to go and make money. He's not just some religious zealot. He's walking in and cleansing the temple, and this is important because it's not something that just anybody could do. This is another major claim, because the right to cleanse the temple was held only by the king. Only by the king. No one else could do that. So he's making this proclamation, "I am the king." Furthermore, Jesus says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." My house shall be called a house of prayer. He's talking about the temple. You're allowed to talk at this point. I'm going to ask a question. Whose house was the temple? Anybody? Yell it out here. Whose house was the temple? God's. There we go. Right, so Jesus is making a claim here. He's not just claiming to be king, he's claiming to be divine. And he's allowing the children to call him the Messiah in the face of the Pharisees, and they want him to stop it. Silence them. He doesn't do it. This was much more than just a religious proclamation of the coming Messiah. No, this was even deeper. It wasn't just religious. You see the temple that was standing at this time was commissioned by King Herod. You read about him early on in Matthew. He dies. And Herod had commissioned this temple. He was kind of like a puppet king. So what the Roman Empire would do is for different areas, if they were still able to be profitable and they would align with Rome, they would allow a standing king to kind of sit there in place as long as they were profitable to the Roman Empire, and they would side with the Romans on any kind of international issue that happened. And so part of what Herod did in order to keep his kingship was when he designed the temple, he did so with specific places that were intended to be operated by money changers, were intended to be operated by merchants. This was intentional. It was in the design of the temple that he commissioned. He wanted there to be money changers. He wanted there to be merchants in the temple. And he did this to keep his kingship, because what that did is it made the temple not just the center of a religious hub, but instead it also made the temple profitable. It became something of a tourist site. And he did this, again, for the appeasement of the Roman Empire. So, Jesus coming in and flipping over the tables of the money changers and casting out the merchants and the people who are selling pigeons. I love how there's like random bits of like really descriptive things in the Bible. Like it's not just people who are selling animals or merchants, it's the ones who are selling the pigeons. But he went in and he kicked all these people out. So this was no longer just a proclamation of a religious zealot. No, it was a statement. Right? It was a statement. It was flying in the face of the Roman government. Yeah, of course, Jesus was coming, and we know that his whole mission was not to overthrow Rome. Right? We know that his mission was not to overthrow Rome. We know that his mission was to come in and to be the suffering servant, to die on the cross for the forgiveness of sins, and to redeem the world, bringing a people and a nation to the Father. Yes, absolutely. But here, he also throws in this indication that he does not support the Roman government. Right? So it's in opposition to Roman rule. And so by these actions, Jesus gave everyone, the crowds, the Pharisees, and the Romans, the same choice. And this choice, I think, is summed up really well in a phrase from Timothy Keller, who says that Jesus gave them this choice, which was crown me or kill me. He leaves no room for debate. He's either Lord, the Messiah, the Son of God, or else he's a blaspheming man who is opposed to all earthly authorities and will incite chaos if left unchecked. Crown me or kill me. No middle ground. No middle ground. So many people want to look and they say, who is Jesus? Oh, he's a good teacher. Who is Jesus? A great role model. Who is Jesus? Well, he's a guy who said some really good things that I think we can all live by. We can put them in our lives. We can be better people. No! He can't be those things. He can't be a good teacher. He can't be a good role model unless he is who he claims to be, the Messiah, the Son of God. Otherwise, he's the farthest thing from a good teacher or a good role model. Crown me or kill me. There's no middle ground. I want to ask you, friends, when you think about Jesus and you ask the question, who is he? What are your thoughts? Do you see him? I mean, really, truly see him as Lord, as King, as the Messiah? Do you see him as a good teacher? There's a passage where Jesus is talking, and he says, "You are neither hot nor cold. You are lukewarm, and I spew you out of my mouth." Crown me or kill me. There's no option. What Jesus doesn't want is for somebody to take the middle ground. He disallows it. You can't do it. You can't say, oh, he was a good man, but he wasn't God. Oh, he's a good man, but he wasn't Messiah. Crown me or kill me. He gives this choice, and then he continues to make statements and to do things that further press the issue. So much so that the religious leaders at the time, their hands are forced. They either allow him to be seen as who he claims to be, which, by the way, doesn't make them look very good, because they're kind of like me when I was running out for my basketball games. Have these really cool handshake, write these really cool prayers. They know a lot. They share all these things, but they're just not very good. They can't be seen but like that. So he presses the issue. They're no longer just looking to discredit him. Now they have to find a way to kill him, because that is a choice he gave them. Crown me or kill me. These statements and actions by Jesus is how his week started off with chants of Hosanna in the highest and ended with chants of crucify him. Because up until this point, Jesus was acting as if he was just a good teacher. Sure, he displayed an enormous amount of power, but what he never did until this day was claim to be the Messiah outwardly or publicly, right? It was always veiled. Never claimed to be divine expressly. But now he is. He's coming in swinging. Crown me or kill me. Friends, hear me when I tell you that he presents you with a similar choice. Only now, post-resurrection, the kill me part of the choice is off the table. The choice is now crown me or be an enemy of the kingdom of heaven. And we need to be clear in stating that the person who's a kingdom or an enemy of the kingdom of heaven would be better off as if they were never born. So what will you do with that choice? Will you surrender all that you have, all that you are? Give it over to the lordship of Jesus Christ? Or will you be an enemy of heaven? There is no middle ground.